Welcome everyone to this Sandscour Great Bow gameplay review. I have 3 games for you today, one against Cindra, one against RKO, and one against -IO. So 2 of the best aggro decks in the format, and while RKO isn't the most popular hero at the minute, the way I approach the matchup is very similar to how I approach most mid-range matchups. There's one thing I'd like to say before we start, and that's how I simplify the deck into 2 different axes. The first is using Riptide's hero ability to reload my arrows for efficient plays, and the second is how I use searchers to enable the big power plays of the deck. Unless I am in a losing position, I will never gamble on hitting with Sandscour or Great Bow, or try to force lines that perhaps let me hit off it. It is really tempting to lean into Sandscour or Great Bow in the off chance that you hit an arrow on top, but that is not the function of the bow in this version of the deck. I emphasize this because I think it is the single most important factor for understanding how the deck works. And with that out of the way, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's begin. Alright, so game 1 against Cindra. I'm going first. I don't really mind going first or second in Cindra. If I go first, I get to set up 6 cards. If I go second, I get tempo. Now, I pitched the Stone Rain here because I can't give an aim counter, and so I want to be able to search it out later with Take the Bait. So I just Arsenal Endless Arrow face up, and I put the buff face down, because the play pattern I'm going to go for here, now that I found Endless Arrow off the bat, is I'm just going to play the pumps from my hand, send Endless Arrow every single turn, and then just block out with everything else. So as you can see, I've drawn a very good hand for blocking here. I should be able to stop Mask of Momentum. Against Cindra, if all goes as according to plan, she shouldn't ever draw off Mask of Momentum. And because it's a 4-card hand here, I'm blocking early because I force the Flick Knives, and then I can just block out whatever comes next. And because there's not one floating here, I'm happy to block 6 and save my armor for later, because if my opponent decides to Arsenal here, then I can't really do much with the cards in my hand anyway. But even if it is for 4 like it is here, then I just give my arm piece and the 3 block, and we're good to go. So yeah, just play Lace of Blood Rot, fire Endless Arrow, and if Cindra wants to block this, I get tempo. If not, I get incredible value. And my opponent chooses to not block this, so I deal 9 damage from 2 cards, and I get Endless Arrow back, so that's 2 card 13. And I'm just going to rinse and repeat as many times as I can. So with this hand here, I've drawn Tar Pit Trap, 2 other 3 blocks, and a buff. And so I'm going to try block with the 3 blocks, keep the buff, and just do the exact same as before. So because I've got Tar Pit Trap as well, I decide to block on Chainlink 1 here, because I know for a fact that I can stop the Mask of Momentum trigger. And if my opponent decides to Flick Knives here, then my blocks are safe for the next Chainlink. So I feel like it's just in a very good spot. When you see Tar Pit Trap, you just know your opponent isn't drawing, basically. And so this is where I plan to Tar Pit Trap, but my opponent decides instead to go for Ancestral Empowerment. I hadn't planned on Ancestral Empowerment being the last card in my opponent's hand. So I use the Buzzsaw Trap here instead, because I get value from the Buzzsaw and I stop the draw from Mask of Momentum conclusively. And again, my opponent doesn't have anything floating here, so because it was Ancestral Empowerment, I did get a little bit punished by holding onto the Tar Pit Trap there, and I end up IPing a little bit. However, because it's Tar Pit Trap, it's not the end of the world. It's a very good trap to have in this matchup, so I don't mind. But as you can see, just doing rinse and repeat, Endless Arrow for 7. I've now got my opponent's block from the boots as well, and that's actually very important because it now means every time my Endless Arrow comes in, if it's coming for 7, I demand 3 cards. If it's coming in for 2, I demand 2 cards. Sorry, if it's coming for 4, I demand 2 cards. So it makes my opponent unable to block it as efficiently. And the reason why I arsenaled the Tar Pit Trap here instead of the Endless Arrow is because I have Tunic online, so it just gives me more options this turn as to how I use my hand. So yeah, just blocking on Chainlink 2 with the Tar Pit Trap. My opponent can flick here, but the next attack action, when it hits, nothing happens. Because this hand doesn't really provide much in terms of alternative playlines, what I do here is I will just use the Fate Foreseen to put the Endless Arrow into my arsenal, keep the Tunic counter, and just shoot Endless Arrow for 4. You can see here I was just deliberating on whether or not I did actually want to use the Tunic to load, but I figured I'd just save it. Now, Codex on top here is interesting. Believe it or not, I think putting it to the bottom here might be the right play, because I'm expecting my Endless Arrow to hit next turn again, because it's very unlikely that my opponent's just going to try to block it out. And so if my Endless Arrow hits, then I want to Arsenal it, and then that Codex is just a 2-block in my hand. I don't want to use the Quiver to get rid of Endless Arrow just for Codex, because I don't have anything that good in my arsenal yet either. Sorry, in my graveyard yet. And now this hand is absolute fire. If I was losing here, this hand is 10 Dominate, rip a card from hand, which is very strong. However, because I'm not behind here, I'm not losing, I'm actually in a very comfortable position here, I'm just going to go with the exact same play pattern that you've seen me do before. I'll block with the Line It Up, the Stone Rain, and the Fate Foreseen, deny the Mass Trigger, and I'll play the Lace of Blood Drop and send Endless Arrow. So I decided to block on Chainlink 1 here just because I'm getting 4 value from that block because it's pain in the backside. I'll let this one hit. And I think I block with the Stone Rain here, or I should. I think what I'm doing here is I'm just considering if I want to use the Stone Rain, but I decide to play the most efficient line. And then Rising Resentment for 4. So hopefully you're seeing as well at this point that if this Fate Foreseen was a Frailty Trap or Inertia Trap, it would just be so much worse. It'd be so much harder to block out Cindra's on hits, because from a numbers perspective, yes, I get the ping, so it's kind of similar value, but it makes it harder for me to stop her from drawing cards, so it's actually less value. And again, rinse and repeat, just Endless Arrow for 7. And my opponent finally decides to give me cards for this. I presume their hand wasn't very good. And now I've drawn into what is an okay hand. So the problem is here, I would really ideally like to get that immobilizing shot face up with the sharpshooters, but I don't want to fire it this turn because it's just for 4. What I'd really like to do is somehow find a way to also fire the Heat Seeker at this turn, but as far as I'm aware, there wasn't a way. So I just put the Heat Seeker in and I get ready to shoot the Heat Seeker using the Tunic counter and just block out with everything else. Just block with the Codex because I don't need it. I'd rather keep the Fate Foreseen because if Heat Seeker hits, I get a card face up and I'll arsenal the Fate Foreseen. And my opponent chooses to not block this, which means, guys, I've just played a 1-card 8. Not too bad, eh? So we get a pump and I arsenal the Fate Foreseen. And as you can see, I've drawn into another Endless Arrow here. So I actually have some interesting choices. I could block with the Endless Arrow and play the Codex. I think that's probably the line I go for here, but we shall see. My opponent now only playing with 3 cards. Again, super easy for me to block out. So I imagine I give the Line It Up, yeah. Rabble for 4, so keeping that D-React in Arsenal instead of the Immobilizing Shot has paid off. Put Blue Widowmaker to the bottom because there's absolutely no use for that card at the minute. And so here I decide to block with Tunic because I figure that I am not going to have an opportunity to use the counter on it again. This does mean that Take the Bait gets considerably worse and other plays, but it's the most efficient block, I think, in that scenario. And now read the glide path here. It lets me choose my Ponder, but if I see something very powerful on top, like a Heat Seeker, then I can load that in with my Sandscour Greatbow instead of firing the code, or instead of playing the Codex. Okay, so I go for the Codex line here, presumably because it rips a card from my opponent's hand, and therefore means that whatever I send can't be blocked unless I get Mask of Momentum. I'm not sure about this play. I think maybe I should go for the Heat Seeker, because that's Heat Seeker for 11. That guarantees taking the whole hand, although it does leave me with no follow-up. I guess the Codex leaves me with a Ponder if my opponent somehow does decide to full block it, which if I remember correctly, I think they do. Yeah, so this was a bit of an unfortunate hand for me to send such a big attack because my opponent happened to have a hand that they wanted to block with, which isn't very common in Cindra. And now, in Toss King Shot, usually that is a terrible Ponder, but because I've got Sarong, I can just fire out the arsenal for 4-go again at the start of my turn. And again, I have Endless Arrow to use here. There's a snatch for 3. I decide to block with the Endless Arrow here. I'm not too sure about this play. I think I probably should have blocked with Take the Bait. Although I guess what I'm wanting to do here is go Intoxicating Shot, Premeditate, Take the Bait for Stone Rain, pitching the Sink Below, and then I get a Ponder. So I guess I don't IP that way, so maybe that actually is the better line to take. And as well, actually, Intoxicating Shot and Take the Bait pair quite nicely together, because you'll notice my opponent has a Courage and a Quicken. Now, instead of that unbricking my opponent's hand, potentially, it just gets used up on the bait token. So there's a bit of synergy there with those two. Yeah, and I suppose I go for the Dominate here because this will put my opponent down to 3 life, and if I find another Take the Bait, then it's basically game over. Or if I just draw into a Dominate Arrow because I've got Sharpshooters, I can just load it in and finish the game that way. So my opponent decides to no block it, go down to 3. Could you as well imagine if I'd had to Take the Bait the turn before this when my opponent had 2 D-Reacts? It would have been crushing. And you can see here the hand that I've drawn into. This is Murky Water for 7 Dominate guaranteed, so that's lethal on its own, but I can also send it in for 10 Dominate with a Deadeye, which is incredibly powerful. And if I want to give up New Horizons and block, that's fine, but if I don't, it's 13 Dominate. So this is basically game winning. I just have to stop any sort of on hit here. There's no way my opponent can get out of this, and I think my opponent concedes at this point, if I am correct. Yes. So that's game 1 in Cindra. You can see the power of Endless Arrow and how effective the value game is. So now this is game 2 into RKO, and again, I just set up a double arsenal in going first and pass back to him. And you'll notice that I start on 38 life, which is a bit of a problem into RKO because RKO loves being above life, but he does also trigger quite a lot of traps, so it's not so easy for him. Here I just block with the blue, and I plan on sending the biggest Endless Arrow that I have ever seen. And with Read the Glide Path here, if I see an arrow on top that I want to keep or put into my arsenal, then I would probably pitch one of the buffs. However, I'm expecting this Endless Arrow to hit, and so I don't load in a different Endless Arrow. So my opponent is just deciding on blocks. And you can see there's a Fiddler's Green in hand, which meant my opponent could not fully block this out. Fiddler's Green's a very good card until you need to block out on hits. And that is a lot of damage I've forced through. So even though he's still on 34, he's functioning at 30. And so if I just full block this out, I'm at higher life. And one thing to quickly mention, in the last game against Cindra, I don't side in Memorial Ground, so I don't really want to block with the Dominate arrows, but against RKO, because I'm worried about fatigue, I do play the Memorial Grounds, so I don't mind blocking with a Stone Rain here. So once again, I just full block and I play the most efficient hand here. I'm not using Sandscour Great Bow this turn, I'm using Riptide's ability essentially. And now I draw into my first Take the Bait. So I could block this claw with the Boulder Trap. When I played this game, I thought Boulder Trap was more relevant than it actually is. It's only really relevant against Mocking Blows. However, I decided to keep it here because I know I'm going to go above life against my opponent unless my opponent wants to give me all their armor. So hence the reason for that. And with the Tunic counter here, it means I can get Murky Water for 10 Dominate and rip a card from my opponent's hand. Now here, I'm not sure what the correct thing to take is. I think E-Strike is pointless because my opponent has another E-Strike. The Mocking Blow isn't live, and so I decide to take the blue, but I'm not sure that's correct. I maybe should have taken the Mocking Blow. And so I know my opponent's going to start the turn with the bait token, but then my opponent will go probably E-Strike for go again into either Claw, Mocking Blow, or maybe something from Arsenal. And so this is just 5 go again. I think here I should use the Boulder Trap because it's unlikely that my opponent has something that triggers my Boulder Trap when I'm at higher life, and I get ultra punished for not using the Boulder Trap earlier. I get juiced by the CNC. Blocking it out is pointless because it means I don't have a turn. There's no real efficient way to block it. I'll just let the Boulder Trap go, and then I'll send 10 Dominate on my turn. And I get 2 ponders to choose from as well. So this is a very strong play. And you'll see that my opponent has the bait token. It's quite common for RKO to play a lot of D-Reacts and Oasis Respite as well. And so having the bait token guarantees that these dominates go through. Very effective against decks that are looking to fatigue you. And so, yeah, once again, Fiddler's Green. It's actually pretty good value here because my opponent couldn't full block anyway. Although getting the armor here, I'm not sure that's correct, but it's probably better saved for when I can, or sorry, it's probably better saved for my opponent can block out an on-hit. And so I decide to Arsenal the Pump here instead of the Drill Shot, because even though I could give the Drill Shot go again, I don't want to play into Fleshbag, so I'd rather just block out efficiently and send something else. Okay, yeah, so by playing the Buzzsaw Trap, I now meet Murky Water's condition of requiring 3 traps in grave. So the line here is to play the Pump from Arsenal, load with Sharpshooters, send 10 Dominate, and then get a trap back. So that's a 3 card, like 13, 14-ish. I'm also getting to choose what's in my hand next turn, which is very good. Or I get to choose like 1 card that's in my hand. Again, opponent just thinking on blocks. If you remember in the deck tech, I mentioned that Codex is a bit weaker in this version of Riptide compared to the other ones, and hopefully over the course of these 2 games already you can see what I mean by that. They're just, the lines with Codex just aren't quite as good as some of the other lines you can take. There's usually something better, or you're trying to do something different, but it's still a very good card. Pitching for the late game is amazing. And now here I think I block the Claw. After getting hit by CNC before this, I feel like I learned my lesson. Now, my opponent discards here to give the Claw go again in reactions, and I have the Collapsing Trap. So I could use the Collapsing Trap here. However, I feel like I'd be cheating a bit because my opponent could just discard it in the damage step, it gets go again, and I can't use the Collapsing Trap. So for the purposes of not, getting my opponent on a technicality, I didn't use the Collapsing Trap there. Because this is a close game and I didn't want to ruin it through a mistake like that. And so I have a decision here. I can block the big bully, or I can send Heatseeker for 13 with 2 very, very good on hits. I'm not sure if this play was really worth it, but we shall see. Because I could have also just blocked 9 and sent Heatseeker for 5. But yeah, this line at least either forces through a load of damage and gets me so much value, or grabs me full tempo. Because Heatseeker has the aim counter, Deadeye is live as well. So my opponent just gives me 1 card here. I can see why my opponent didn't decide to fully block this one out, I guess. I'm low on life and my opponent here can send 6 damage, but my opponent also going to 8 when I've got a lot of dominate in the deck is risky. And so you can see I've drawn into my Memorial Ground, my first one. So I decide to block 3 here. I'll take 3 when RKO uses his hero power, and then I'll be able to go 10 dominate and rip 2 cards from my opponent's hand. And here showcasing the versatility of the yellow buffs and why they're so important, because they can basically do everything in the deck. And you'll note here I decide to put hold priority on. That's because when I'm in a late game and I'm sending Stone Rain with Deadeye, I like to resolve the Deadeye after the Stone Rain because I want to make sure that my opponent has as bad a turn as possible, especially when we're at these low life totals. If it's in the early game, I would do it the other way around just to take the best card from my opponent's hand. But at this stage, I'd rather my opponent had a non-functional hand, essentially. And so I resolve the Deadeye second, and I take the Looking for Scrap. My opponent has Tunic up, so I can just take a claw, block, and then move on with my life. And so here, yep, decide to block with New Horizons. My plan here is to play Release the Tension, loading in the Intoxicating Shot, using Strong to give it a go again. Then I can activate Sandscour. If I see something good on top, I'll play it. If not, I'll just fire it away. Fire the Widowmaker away. So yeah, my opponent has an Oasis Respite here, getting very good value from it. 1 card 5 is not bad, and it also helps cover up this breakpoint. No arrow on top, so I just fire the Widowmaker. Now my opponent does have Scab Skins, which basically nullifies Widowmaker's effect, which is unfortunate for me. However, if I'm going to compare it to Infecting Shot, which is a card a lot of people like to play in this spot. Oh, my opponent conceded here. Yeah, my opponent has an all red hand, so just scoops on the spot. I think I check my hand just to make sure. Yeah, so my hand there is Take the Bait, Stone Rain, and 2 buffs, so I win anyway. So yeah, on to game 3. This is against the Dio. The Dio is going first, sets up an item, 5 card hand. Now, I could send Murky Water for 10 dominate here, but I'd get rid of my Collapsing Trap and that just isn't worth it. So I just decide to play Endless Arrow here for 7 instead. It's very unlikely that my opponent blocks this out too. Opening Collapsing Trap this early in the game is very, very lucky. And against Dio, she's not really a combo deck, so I just use Collapsing Trap on the first chain link to cause as much disruption as possible. But as well, by getting more cards from her hand, I get her a bit closer to Fatigue. Into some Dios, Fatigue is the angle that you'll take. And I get quite punished by this Pulsewave Harpoon here. Unfortunately, there's no way really to avoid it, unless I want to use the Sharpshooters to, say, fire a Heat Seeker. But it's fine, I'll just block and Arsenal pass. My opponent's on a 4 card hand, so it's not that bad. I could block with a Premeditate here, but I want to save it. I'm going to get more value from sending it, so I'll just Arsenal, drop my next hand, and then I'll be able to use it for better than blocking 2. And once again, I open Target Trap. Target Trap in this matchup is insane. There's few on hits and also boom grenades to take care of, and Target Trap does that perfectly. But yep, just looking to block out now and send that in. Send something. My Tunic is reaching 3, but my goal here is to keep at least one of the yellows in my hand and play the Heat Seeker. Now, my opponent plays Null Time Zone off the top and calls Target Trap here. It shows my opponent has played this matchup before because Target Trap is probably the card to worry about the most. However, Null Time Zone is not that bad for us because we have access to the arsenal and all our attacks go through the arsenal as well. yeah, my opponent is just setting up for next turn, setting up a 5-card hand. Now, this turn, I think I misplayed quite badly. For starters, I IP myself if I keep the Tar Pit Trap here because I've got a Ponder with this Heat Seeker, which means I'm going to be drawing 2 cards if it hits. And if it doesn't hit, I don't want to be arsenaling the Tar Pit Trap anyway. So what I should do is play the Deadeye and pitch the Tar Pit Trap and then load the Heat Seeker with Riptide's ability. And you'll see I also make another misplay here. I fired the Immobilizing Shot for 7. For starters, my opponent can just cover that with armor very easily. But also, it's a pointless play because if I just send the Heat Seeker for 8, that means the Immobilizing Shot is going face up to Arsenal for next turn anyway. So it's just the wrong play that I make here. And I do get punished for it because my opponent does give armor and it essentially does nothing. That being said, I do have a good turn coming up next because I can just Arsenal Heat Seeker and then use Tunic to shoot it. I don't need to Arsenal the Tar Pit Trap now because my opponent has got rid of the null time zone with the adaptive plating. And so just looking at this hand, Heat Seeker for 8 is most likely going to be the line that I go for next. No point blocking the seal for 60 out with the sink below as tempting as it is because there's no on-hit yet. But now I do decide to block out the Fast and Furious because there's only 2 cards left in hand. I want to get the most value that I can out of these cards. I don't want to end up IPing, basically. Okay, so my opponent plays out a Boom Grenade and cranks, then goes for a Spark of Genius. And so my opponent is just setting up deal things here, setting up lots of items. My opponent here sends the Throttle. There is the option here of going Tar Pit Trap and blocking with all my armor, but because I've got Fate Foreseen, I know I can cover up anything that my opponent sends, and if it's even a zipper hit, then I can just give 1 bit of armor and keep this Throng for later. So I just use the Tar Pit Trap here so the Boom Grenade doesn't trigger. And then the last card, I believe, is, yeah, so it's 0 to 60, yellow. So I could also just block this with armor because it's coming in for 3. I don't have to go with Fate Foreseen, and if the Heat Seeker hits, then again, I get that card face up in Arsenal, Heat Seeker, Fate Foreseen face down Arsenal, and then 6-card hand to play with, which is very, very strong. Oh, my opponent goes for a backup protocol play here, which I didn't see at the time, but yeah, so here I decide to block with the pump and use the Fate Foreseen as well. But at least now I can see what Heat Seeker is giving me. I decided to put that to the bottom just because, well, it's not really doing much for me. It's just a nimblism essentially. And so here, just Heat Seeker, 1 card 5, and if it hits, 1 card 8. Maybe more. Okay, my opponent blocks out. Got a lot of blues in hand, so I'm just guessing it wasn't a very good hand defensively. But again, the more my opponent blocks out, the more fatigue becomes a secondary game plan. And if that Heat Seeker had hit, by the way, that Stone Rain on the left would have been the card that goes up, and it would have got an aim counter from Sandscour Great Bow. So the value in that Heat Seeker would have been a 1 card 9, but with more implied value because I can buff the Stone Rain. And because I saw a Mobilizing Shot on top, I decided to send the Stone Rain for less damage, but it means I've got an arrow with an aim counter that's disruptive for the next turn. And I could send a Mobilizing Shot here, but a Mobilizing Shot is just tempo, and I'm a little bit behind here, so I'd rather send the Stone Rain, disrupt my opponent, rip a card from them permanently because it's got Seek and Destroy, and then I've got Mobilizing Shot for when I really need it. And my opponent is just considering if they want to block this. Now they block with the Teklo Foundry Heart here, which is, in my opinion, a mistake because it now means that when I fire a Mobilizing Shot, even if it's just for 4, my opponent needs to give me 2 cards if they don't want the on-hit effect to be active. And blocking the Teklo Foundry Heart here doesn't stop anything is just, I guess, stopping psychological damage. So I think this is a mistake to block with a Tech Foundry Heart. Okay, so I don't remember what I did on this turn too well, but I imagine I did quite a bit of blocking because this hand isn't that good offensively. Yeah, so I think I'd decide to block out. If anything, I would block with the line it up, the sink below, send the immobilizing shot, and Arsenal to take the bait to guarantee something good for next turn. Once again, sinking for Fate Foreseen, a great combination. Yeah, so the Pulse Wave Harpoon basically forces me to get rid of the take the bait, but I think ideally I would have kept that. And my opponent sends Throttle here, so I have the option of not blocking this with the Fate Foreseen, but I decide in the end to block with a Fate Foreseen, even though there's no one hit here, because I'm sending a mobilizing shot next turn and my opponent has to give me 2 cards to stop it. There's a world in which I send the mobilizing shot, my opponent gives me 2 cards, just plays an item and passes, arsening the last card, and in which case the Fate Foreseen, I didn't get value from it, and so I'm just using it now just to guarantee that I at least get 4 life from it. And I also get to sculpt my next hand a little bit too. And you'll see there, the Seek and Destroy and the Stone Rain triggers, they're both my triggers, so I get to choose the order in which they resolve. Quite a lot of people are not aware of that ruling. I do have a video on it, and I'll link it down below so that you can check that one out. But now you can see sending the mobilizing shot for 4 is very powerful because my opponent doesn't have the 1 block from the Tekla Foundry Heart. Yeah, my opponent chooses to take the immobilizing shot here, just blocking efficiently, and my opponent actually has quite a good turn here. But my turn is very straightforward. I'll just play the pump, load in the Heat Seeker, fire it, and then keep the sink below for when it actually matters. Hopefully you're seeing here as well just how powerful Tunic is in these matchups. The amount of value Tunic has accrued me in these games, especially with Heat Seeker, is amazing. Because of Tunic, this play here is a 2-card 13-ish. Really strong. That's Felling of the Crown numbers. Although it does get me a blue Widowmaker, which isn't ideal, so scratch what I just said. But better than nothing. And now my opponent gets quite a fortunate hand here because it's double T-bone, so I have to give New Horizons, but it does mean I get to get rid of the Widowmaker, so it's not all that bad, but it does mean I am inefficient with the sink below. Yep, no need to fully block out the zipper hit, so now it's gone for 2 here, which is not worth blocking really. And so my play here is, although Deadeye is a 2-card, it's a 2-card 3, but it does mean I'm presenting 7 damage, and with my opponent at 7, it means my opponent now has to start blocking me. And I choose End the Sorrow off the Codex here because I'm also on life, so I really want to start that play pattern of block out with hand, send End the Sorrow. And I get rewarded for choosing the End the Sorrow here because Line It Up is a terrible Ponder target. It's probably the worst one in the deck. And here you can see just how good Tarpit Trap is. It means now if this next attack action hits, it doesn't trigger the Boom Grenade, but my opponent doesn't send anything else. I'm guessing my opponent wants to set up here, and sadly for my opponent that means that I have guaranteed lethal. Again, my buff is a 2-card 7, but the on hit is the end of the game in my favor, which is good value in my opinion. And that concludes the Sandscour Great Bow Riptide gameplay video. Hopefully, if you weren't a believer before, you're maybe slightly more of a believer now, and you at least have an idea of some of the play patterns that I'm looking to use with this deck. If you have any suggestions, any comments, anything that you think maybe could be optimized in the list, I'd love to hear it, because again, this is a very underexplored, but in my opinion, very powerful way to play Riptide. And with that, I've run out of things to say, so I wish you a very good day.